She thought men were the problem. Then she dated women. I'm tired of explaining my emotions to men. So I decided to date women instead. That was the sentence she posted on her private blog one rainy Thursday night. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a punchline. It was her truth. And it came from years of dating men who, in her experience, always seemed to misunderstand her, misinterpret her words, or worse, dismiss her feelings entirely. She had grown up watching women carry emotional weight in silence. She saw her mother apologize for things she didn't cause. She saw her friends twist themselves into emotional yoga poses just to be heard in relationships that always felt lopsided. And when she entered adulthood, when she started dating seriously, it didn't take long before she found herself doing the same, explaining. So much explaining. Explaining why she felt overwhelmed, explaining why silence hurt more than shouting, explaining that "I'm fine" was never meant to be the final answer. She read the books. She watched the TED Talks. She followed the therapists and influencers who gave voice to what she felt but couldn't say. There was a pattern, and in that pattern she noticed one constant: men. It wasn't hate, it was exhaustion. It wasn't that men were evil. It was that they never seemed to get it. The emotional labor always fell on her shoulders. The self-awareness, the unpacking of trauma, the communication, it was always her job. So when she said it, "I'm tired of explaining my emotions to men," she meant it in her bones. And for the first time, she felt clarity. The suggestion had come up before. A friend at a book club had once smirked and said, "You'd probably have more luck dating women." She had laughed, deflecting the idea like it was a quirky thought experiment. But the seed had been planted. And after one too many dates that ended in emotional dead ends, that seed began to grow. Women understand women. At least that was the theory. Women get nuance. Women listen. Women are gentle. That was the promise. She started to believe that maybe the issue wasn't her expectations, maybe she had just been choosing the wrong team. So she made the switch. The decision felt oddly liberating, not just as a feminist, but as a person who wanted connection without having to justify her needs. She didn't feel like she was betraying anyone. She felt like she was coming back to herself. Creating her dating profile was an act of defiance and hope. She didn't write it for the algorithm, she wrote it for honesty. Emotionally intelligent, ambitious, big on communication and empathy. She typed, "I'm not here for games. I'm here for something real, mutual, and grown." She expected fewer responses than usual, but the inbox filled quickly. And the messages were different, longer, more intentional, less wide at 11 p.m. and more "I read your profile and felt like you were speaking my language." She met someone, a woman named Kara. She had short dark hair, a quiet confidence, and a softness in the way she spoke that felt grounding. Their first phone call lasted 2 hours. They talked about childhood wounds, creative dreams, and their shared hatred of passive-aggressive texting. This was it. This was what she had been missing. On the night of their first date, she didn't feel the usual nervous energy. She felt calm. There was no need to overthink what she wore, how she spoke, or how much space she took up. She believed, truly believed, that this would be different. Over dinner, they spoke about emotional safety, astrology, and attachment styles. Kara nodded at all the right times. She even paused before answering questions, as if giving space to every word. She left that night feeling light, not ecstatic, not head over heels, just light. like she had finally found someone who saw her, or at least someone who wanted to. She told her friends it was refreshing. "It's just so much easier," she said. "It feels like I don't have to translate everything I'm feeling." Her friends nodded, supportive and curious. The next few weeks moved slowly, intentionally. There were coffee shop mornings, shared playlists, deep conversations about boundaries and love languages. No mind games, no power struggles. At least, that's how it seemed. But then something shifted. Small at first, like a misstep in a dance. A moment of silence that lasted just a beat too long. A message left unread for 2 days. A gentle critique that felt more like a dig. She brushed it off. Everyone has bad days. But the moments added up. Kara became harder to read. She'd pull back emotionally, then accuse her of being too needy. When she asked for clarity, Kara would sigh and say, "You're overthinking again." Wait, that sounded familiar. Too familiar. She began to feel the old anxiety rise. The same pressure to explain her feelings. The same frustration when they were minimized. The same emotional labor, only now wrapped in softer language. Was this déjà vu, or was something deeper happening? She sat with the discomfort. She reread her own texts. She tried to be fair. Maybe she was projecting. Maybe she expected too much. Maybe. Or maybe something else was happening. It wasn't just about Kara. It was about the realization slowly creeping in she had carried an entire belief system into this new chapter. And now that system was starting to crack. She had walked in thinking the problem was men. Now, for the first time, she was starting to wonder, what if it wasn't that simple? What if the hard parts of love didn't belong to a gender, and what if she had to face something scarier than being misunderstood? The possibility that she had misunderstood others all along. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet, but something in her had shifted, and it would only deepen from here. The first date and the slap to her expectations. The restaurant was small, quiet, and just dim enough to feel intentional. Candles flickered on every table. A jazz trio played in the background, their saxophone gently weaving between clinking glasses and murmured conversations. The air carried the scent of rosemary and red wine. It was the kind of place people chose when they wanted to impress without trying too hard. And that's exactly how it felt when Kara chose it. She arrived 5 minutes early, like always. She liked being early. It gave her time to breathe. She checked her reflection in the window, smoothed the crease in her shirt, and walked in with a sense of calm that had been rare in her past dating experiences. When Kara arrived, she looked just like her photos, polished, relaxed, confident. She gave a soft smile and leaned in for a brief hug, not too forward, not too cold. They sat across from each other, ordered cocktails, and for the first few minutes, everything was exactly how she had imagined it. They talked about art, about their favorite sad song, and about how hard it was to find friends as adults. Kara had a way with words. Every sentence felt curated, almost poetic. But somewhere around the second drink, the tone began to shift. It wasn't one thing when it was a slow turn. Kara's questions started to change. They weren't just curious, they were strategic, calculated. What do you look for in a partner? How do you usually handle conflict? What would your ex say was your biggest flaw? The questions came faster, sharper, less like a conversation and more like a job interview disguised as intimacy. She answered, of course. She always answered. But something about the delivery made her feel small, measured. And Kara never really shared back, not in the same way. Instead of responding to her answers with openness or vulnerability, Kara dissected them. She offered interpretations, assumptions, gentle critiques wrapped in therapeutic language. That sounds like a boundary issue. Have you done any work around your attachment patterns? Sounds like a father wound to me. It wasn't rude, exactly. It was articulate, polished, but it was also cold, detached. She felt like she was being analyzed instead of known. A flicker of doubt passed through her chest. Was this what emotional intelligence looked like? Or was it just control dressed up in softer words? She tried to redirect the energy. Asked Kara about her childhood, her last relationship, what made her feel safe. But the answers were vague, brief, and always came with a subtle pivot back to her. It wasn't a conversation, it was a spotlight. And she was under it alone. Halfway through dinner, she began to feel drained. Her fork hovered above the plate while Kara explained how some people mistake anxiety for intuition. Her mind began to wander. Was this what it felt like to be on the other side of therapy speak? Was this what men experienced when women demanded emotional labor before offering emotional safety? She shifted in her seat. It wasn't that Kara was mean. She wasn't. She was calm, measured. She never raised her voice, but everything felt tight, controlled, like Kara had a script in her head for how the date should go, and every deviation was a minor inconvenience. And suddenly she saw something that made her chest tighten. Kara wasn't giving her space to be. She was managing the conversation like a power dynamic. Every question was a test, every silence was a judgment. And in that moment, she thought something that made her freeze. Wait, is this what guys feel like? That pressure to say the right thing, to impress, to navigate expectations that are never fully spoken, that quiet, creeping fear that anything too honest will be seen as weakness. She remembered dates with men where she had done the same. Interrogated without warmth, expected without giving, evaluated instead of engaging. A memory surfaced. A man once told her, "It always feels like I'm being graded." She had rolled her eyes then, but now she got it. This wasn't the emotional connection she had imagined. This was performance, and she wasn't sure who it was for anymore. As they wrapped up dinner, Kara suggested they skip dessert. Too many carbs. She smiled. It was a joke, maybe, but the warmth didn't land. Walking to the train, she listened as Kara explained the politics of modern dating, the importance of communication, and why most people lack emotional maturity. It all made sense, intellectually, but emotionally, it left her cold. She got home that night and stared at the ceiling in silence. She didn't feel seen. She felt scanned. She didn't feel known. She felt studied. And for the first time since starting this journey, a small crack appeared in her confidence. Maybe this wouldn't be as easy as she thought. Maybe gender didn't guarantee understanding. And maybe, just maybe, she had stepped into something far more complex than she was ready for, but she wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. She still believed the next date would be different, and in that belief, she missed the real shift already happening inside her. The first date and the slap to her expectations. The restaurant was small, quiet, and just dim enough to feel intentional. Candles flickered on every table. A jazz trio played in the background, their saxophone gently weaving between clinking glasses and murmured conversations. The air carried the scent of rosemary and red wine. It was the kind of place people chose when they wanted to impress without trying too hard. And that's exactly how it felt when Kara chose it. She arrived 5 minutes early, like always. She liked being early. It gave her time to breathe. She checked her reflection in the window, smoothed the crease in her shirt, and walked in with a sense of calm that had been rare in her past dating experiences. When Kara arrived, she looked just like her photos, polished, relaxed, confident. She gave a soft smile and leaned in for a brief hug. Not too forward, not too cold. They sat across from each other, ordered cocktails, and for the first few minutes, everything was exactly how she had imagined it. They talked about art, about their favorite sad songs, about how hard it was to find friends as adults. Kara had a way with words. Every sentence felt curated, almost poetic. But somewhere around the second drink, the tone began to shift. It wasn't one thing. It was a slow turn. Kara's questions started to change. They weren't just curious, they were strategic, calculated. What do you look for in a partner? How do you usually handle conflict? What would your ex say was your biggest flaw? The questions came faster. Sharper, less like a conversation and more like a job interview disguised as intimacy. She answered. Of course. She always answered. But something about the delivery made her feel small, measured, and Kara never really shared back. Not in the same way. Instead of responding to her answers with openness or vulnerability, Kara dissected them. She offered interpretations, assumptions, gentle critiques wrapped in therapeutic language. That sounds like a boundary issue. Have you done any work around your attachment patterns? Sounds like a father wound to me. It wasn't rude, exactly. It was articulate, polished, but it was also cold, detached. She felt like she was being analyzed instead of known. A flicker of doubt passed through her chest. Was this what emotional intelligence looked like, or was it just control dressed up in softer words? She tried to redirect the energy. Asked Kara about her childhood, her last relationship. What made her feel safe? But the answers were vague, brief, and always came with a subtle pivot back to her. It wasn't a conversation, it was a spotlight, and she was under it alone. Halfway through dinner, she began to feel drained. Her fork hovered above the plate while Kara explained how some people mistake anxiety for intuition. Her mind began to wander. Was this what it felt like to be on the other side of therapy speak? Was this what men experienced when women demanded emotional labor before offering emotional safety? She shifted in her seat. It wasn't that Kara was mean. She was calm, measured. She never raised her voice. But everything felt tight, controlled. Like Kara had a script in her head for how the date should go, and every deviation was a minor inconvenience. And suddenly, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Kara wasn't giving her space to be. She was managing the conversation like a power dynamic. Every question was a test. Every silence was a judgment. And in that moment, she thought something that made her freeze. Wait, is this what guys feel like? That pressure to say the right thing, to impress, to navigate expectations that are never fully spoken, that quiet, creeping fear that anything too honest will be seen as weakness. She remembered dates with men where she had done the same, interrogated without warmth, expected without giving, evaluated instead of engaging. A memory surfaced. A man once told her, "It always feels like I'm being graded." She had rolled her eyes then, but now she got it. This wasn't the emotional connection she had imagined. This was performance, and she wasn't sure who it was for anymore. As they wrapped up dinner, Kara suggested they skip dessert. Too many carbs. She smiled. It was a joke, maybe, But the warmth didn't land. Walking to the train, she listened as Kara explained the politics of modern dating, the importance of communication, and why most people lack emotional maturity. It all made sense, intellectually, but emotionally, it left her cold. She got home that night and stared at the ceiling in silence. She didn't feel seen. She felt scanned. She didn't feel known. She felt studied. And for the first time since starting this journey, a small crack appeared in her confidence. Maybe this wouldn't be as easy as she thought. Maybe gender didn't guarantee understanding. And maybe, just maybe, she had stepped into something far more complex than she was ready for. But she wasn't ready to quit, not yet. She still believed the next date would be different, and in that belief, she missed the real shift already happening inside her. The more they met, the more it felt like dating herself. The second date started casual enough. They met at a local bookstore cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs, indie folk music, and the lingering scent of burnt espresso. It felt softer than the last time, less formal, no candlelight, no wine, just daylight and words. But within minutes, the conversation turned sharp. It wasn't planned. It never is. It began with a quote from a book they both liked. Something about power dynamics in modern relationships. And just like that, they were in it, not a fight, not yet, but a fast-moving intellectual tennis match. Back and forth, opinion and rebuttal. She made a comment about how some gender expectations hurt both men and women. Kara's smile dropped. "That's just centering men again," she said flatly. "Women have been carrying this for centuries. Men are just catching up." She nodded, trying to stay open, but added, "Sure, but aren't we all trapped in roles we didn't choose? Isn't the goal empathy for everyone, not just one side?" Kara crossed her arms. "That sounds dangerously close to not all men." The air shifted. She felt it, that tightening, that invisible wall going up. And she hated that she recognized it because she'd been on the other side of that wall so many times. She tried to clarify, tried to say she wasn't excusing anyone, that she just wanted to understand the whole picture. But Kara had already withdrawn, her face calm but closed. After a pause, Kara asked, "Do you even believe in emotional accountability?" That question hit harder than expected. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was an accusation when they changed the subject, or tried to. But it never really left. Later, walking through the park, she reached for connection. She talked about her struggles growing up, the pressure to be perfect, to take care of everyone else's emotions. She shared it not to complain, but to be known. Kara nodded quietly, then asked, "Did you ever figure out where that savior complex comes from?" It wasn't curiosity. It was analysis. Again. She stopped walking, looked at Kara. "Can I ask you something?" Kara shrugged. "Sure. Do you feel like you know me?" There was a pause, a beat too long. Kara smiled politely. "I think I'm getting there." She didn't believe it. She tried again, more directly this time. "What do you need from me to feel safe in this?" Kara tilted her head. "If you have to ask. Maybe you don't understand me at all." The words dropped like a rock into still water. No anger, no shouting, just that sentence. And in that moment, something in her cracked. Because she'd said those exact words before, not in this relationship, in others, to men, to people who were trying, but not getting it fast enough. If you have to ask, maybe you don't understand me at all. She remembered the feeling of control that came with that sentence, the righteousness, the belief that if they truly cared, they'd already know. And now she was on the other side. She didn't feel empowered. She felt helpless. It wasn't that she didn't want to understand Kara. She did. But she needed space to ask. She needed the freedom to not know everything. That night, back home, she sat in silence. No music, no TV, just thoughts. She had spent years believing that men were emotionally underdeveloped, that they were careless with words and clueless with feelings. And maybe some of that was true. But now she was facing something else, the possibility that emotional difficulty wasn't gendered. It was human. Kara wasn't a bad person. She wasn't even unkind. But she expected to be understood without having to be clear. She wanted vulnerability from someone else while staying protected herself. It was a mirror, and what she saw in that mirror was herself. All those times she had dismissed men's confusion as emotional immaturity. All those moments where she'd sighed and said, just forget it, instead of explaining what she needed. All those tests she set up without warning, only to punish them for failing. She had been Kara. She had been demanding, mysterious, passive-aggressive, all in the name of being emotionally aware. And now she was standing in front of that same energy, feeling just as lost, just as exhausted, just as invisible. It wasn't just humbling, it was shattering. Because if she had been the problem too, what else had she misunderstood? She didn't have the answers. Not yet. But for the first time in her adult life, she was starting to ask a new kind of question. Not why don't they get it, but have I been fair, and beneath that, even softer, even harder? What kind of partner have I really been? The walk home felt longer than usual. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was just quiet, like someone who had opened a door they didn't know existed. And behind it was something deeper than blame. It was truth. And it was waiting. When two women date, and no one is the man. By the third date, something unspoken had already started to build. It wasn't chemistry. It wasn't tension. It was confusion. A low hum of emotional static that neither of them could name, but both of them could feel. They met at Kara's apartment this time. Takeout, a bottle of wine, soft lighting, and the pretense of comfort. The night began with small talk and half-hearted laughter. But the warmth from the first date was gone. Everything felt careful, measured, like both of them were waiting for the other to steer the night in a certain direction. But no one did. They sat on the couch, legs crossed away from each other, scrolling through movie options they weren't actually interested in watching. "So what are you in the mood for?" Kara asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. Whatever you feel like." Kara sighed lightly. "I just want you to take the lead sometimes." That sentence hung in the air like cigarette smoke. She blinked. "I didn't want to push. I thought I was giving you space." Kara looked away. "It's like I'm doing all the emotional heavy lifting, and then that's when it clicked. The irony, the twist that no book, no podcast, no empowerment post had ever prepared her for. Neither of them wanted to take the lead, not just for movie choices or dinner plans, but emotionally, spiritually. In the rhythm of the relationship, no one was holding the container. No one was grounding the conversation. No one was making the hard calls or saying the hard truths, because both of them were waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard, waiting to feel safe enough for the other to go first. It was a stalemate of softness, and it turned brittle. Kara started pointing out small things: how she never initiated texts first, how she didn't open up fast enough, how her silence sometimes felt like withdrawal. She tried to explain herself, but the words felt weak. And more than that, she didn't feel like she was allowed to be unsure anymore. At some point, Kara went quiet. The room fell still. The TV flickered on the wall, casting light but no warmth. Neither of them moved to close the gap. Neither of them reached out. And the strangest part, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. There were no slammed doors or raised voices, just two people slowly drifting, emotionally paralyzed. Neither willing to be the one who risked first. They were like two boats drifting in open water. No anchor, no captain, no map, just floating. And as she sat there, staring at her half-finished glass of wine, a thought surfaced, quiet, uncomfortable, and honest. This is what men must feel like. Not all men, not always. But the kind who try, the kind who show up but never quite know what they're allowed to be, the kind who get told to lead but are criticized when they do, who try to read minds instead of being told the truth, who get called emotionally unavailable for not guessing the right answer. She thought back to an ex-boyfriend who once asked, "Do you want me to fix this or just listen?" She had rolled her eyes then, but now she saw it for what it was, a plea for clarity. And in this moment, there was no clarity. There was only fog. They said their goodbyes awkwardly. No hug, no text me when you get home. Just a nod, a pause, and a door that shut too softly. The silence afterward wasn't peaceful. It was loud. She walked home not feeling hurt, not even angry, just hollow. Because now she understood something that theory had never explained. When two people both want to receive and no one wants to give first, intimacy dies. When two people want to be led but fear being vulnerable, the connection collapses under its own weight. And when both partners are waiting to be emotionally rescued, no one survives the storm. She had always resisted the idea of the man's role in relationships. To her, that was outdated, but now she saw it differently. Not as gender, not as dominance, but as structure, as grounding, as emotional containment, not control, not superiority. Just someone who says, "I've got this, you're safe, I'll take care of what's hard right now." And neither of them had done that, because both of them had been taught to protect themselves above all else, to avoid being too much, to never need, to never ask. And that protection became a wall, and that wall killed the connection. She sat on her bed that night, shoes still on, staring at nothing in particular. Then she whispered out loud, almost involuntarily, "Now I get it. She didn't mean the date. She meant men, the silent pressure, the damned if you do dilemma, the exhausting need to anticipate someone else's feelings without any clear roadmap." She had judged it, criticized it, made jokes about it, and now she felt it in her bones, not as a theory, but as a lived truth. "I'm starting to understand why so many men feel lost when dating modern women," she said to herself. It wasn't self-pity. It was the beginning of empathy. And maybe, just maybe, that was what had been missing all along. Alone with her thoughts, she realized how much she got wrong. The apartment was quiet. No buzzing phone, no plans to rush off to. Just the hum of the fridge and the occasional groan of the pipes behind the wall. She sat cross-legged on her couch, arms folded, eyes unfocused. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about Kara, not directly. She was thinking about someone else, her ex, They hadn't spoken in over a year. The last conversation ended in a familiar mess, a fight that spiraled from silence into blame, from frustration into tears. At the time, she walked away feeling righteous. She told her friends he was emotionally unavailable, distant, confusing. But now, sitting in the stillness of her own disappointment, another memory surfaced. A night when he had asked gently, "What do you want me to do?" She had scoffed. "If you have to ask, you're not paying attention." She had believed she was right. That love meant knowing without needing to be told. That real connection didn't require directions. But now she saw something else in his question, a kind of desperation. Not the kind that pleads, and the kind that tries quietly, clumsily, willingly. She replayed so many of their arguments in her head. The nights she accused him of shutting down, when really, he was trying not to make things worse. The moments she claimed he didn't care, when maybe he cared so much he became afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I used to think he was cold," she whispered to herself. But maybe he was just scared. It hit her then, deeper than expected. She had spent so much energy trying to be understood. She never stopped to think how terrifying it might have been for him to try to understand her and still fail. She had always assumed he had the power, that men always did. But now she remembered how often he deferred, how often he tried to read her mood like a puzzle he was never given the pieces for. There were times he stayed silent, not out of arrogance but out of fear. Not fear of her, but fear of hurting her. She never considered how much pressure that might have been. And suddenly, her entire narrative began to crack. What if emotional labor wasn't just something women carried? What if men carried it too, just in ways they were never allowed to talk about? He used to take long pauses before responding in arguments. She thought he was avoiding. Maybe he was filtering, choosing his words carefully and trying not to cause harm. What she once labeled as distance might have been restraint. What she once saw as disinterest might have been uncertainty. And what she once called emotional laziness might have been emotional fear. She leaned back, the room suddenly heavier. This wasn't about taking blame. This wasn't about erasing real struggles. She still believed in fairness. She still believed in naming imbalance where it existed. But she also believed in truth. And the truth was she had been wrong about some things. The ideology she once carried, strong, clear, uncompromising, didn't account for this nuance. It didn't leave room for male hesitation rooted in vulnerability. It didn't leave room for the fact that women, too, can withhold, manipulate, or remain emotionally closed. It had taught her how to critique, but not how to connect. And now, sitting in the silence of her own thoughts, she realized something no article, no slogan, no activist panel had ever told her. Human emotion doesn't follow political lines. It doesn't care about gender theory. It doesn't split neatly into roles and scripts. It's messy, it's uncertain, it's terrifying. And the fear of hurting someone, the fear of not being enough, the fear of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. That fear is not male or female, it's human. She felt a lump rise in her throat, not from guilt, but from clarity. For the first time, she wasn't looking for someone to blame. She was just trying to understand. And that, she realized, was the beginning of something real, not a relationship, but maturity. And maybe, for the first time in her life, she was ready for that. Men aren't perfect, but they did try to warn us. She found herself reading things she used to scroll past. Reddit threads, blog posts, even anonymous comments, places where men talked openly about relationships, vulnerability, and emotional exhaustion. Before, she would have dismissed them. Too defensive, too whiny, too much poor me energy. But now, she didn't flinch. She leaned in. One post stood out. A man wrote, "I want to be emotionally available. I just don't know what the rules are. Sometimes I'm too cold. Sometimes I'm too open and get mocked for being weak. I can't win." So I shut down. She read it twice, then a third time. And for the first time, she didn't roll her eyes. She didn't get defensive. She didn't think about how women had it worse. She just sat there and thought, "I get it." She remembered how Kara wanted her to be vulnerable but never gave her space to do it wrong. How every attempt felt like a test. How every mistake was labeled a red flag. And suddenly, all those male voices, the ones she once ignored, sounded less like excuses and more like echoes of her own confusion. Men weren't asking to be pitied. They were asking for permission. Permission to feel without failing. Permission to try without being humiliated. It didn't make them right about everything, but it made their experience real. She kept reading. A thread titled "Things Men Wish They Could Say" caught her eye. "I'm scared of being seen as weak. I want to talk about my feelings but not be punished for them later. Sometimes I don't know what you want. I wish you'd just tell me." She thought about how many times she had expected her partner to just know, how often she had withheld, then blamed him for not being psychic. And now she was seeing it from the other side. It wasn't about men being better. It wasn't about women being worse. It was about how hard it is to love and be loved when both people are terrified. Women weren't easier. They were just different. Complicated in their own ways. Difficult in ways no one talks about. It was the illusion of shared emotional fluency that made the silence between her and Kara even more deafening. They both spoke the language, but neither of them knew how to listen. And that realization broke something open. She wasn't angry at feminism. She wasn't rejecting her values. She still believed in equality. Still believed women had been silenced for too long. Still believed that too many men hide behind toughness and pride. But she also believed something else now. That sometimes, the movement she followed had simplified things too much. It had turned pain into a gender war. And in doing so, it made people like her miss what was right in front of them, that everyone is bleeding in their own way. She didn't abandon her ideals. She just held them more softly. She became less quick to judge, less eager to call someone toxic because they stumbled. She didn't become an anti-feminist. She became humble. The kind of humble that doesn't need to be right all the time. The kind that listens before it labels. The kind that says, "Tell me more," instead of "You should already know." She once believed she had the moral high ground, that she saw things clearer. Now she saw something else, that clarity doesn't come from certainty. It comes from compassion. And that shift in her wasn't loud. It wasn't something she could post or turn into a quote. It was quiet and real and irreversible. Love is about maturity, not gender. Weeks passed. She stopped dating, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel desperate to connect. She felt focused, like someone who had just come out of a long, confusing dream and was finally awake. She didn't regret dating Kara. She didn't regret the conversations, the confusion, the discomfort. In a way, those experiences gave her more than any happy ending could have. They gave her truth. And from that truth, she pulled out 3 things she knew she could carry forward. The first was simple. But hard-earned dating is not about finding someone who's just like you. For years, she'd been looking for emotional compatibility, for shared language, for mutual beliefs. She thought sameness would equal safety. She thought someone who felt like her would understand her better. But she was wrong. What she needed wasn't someone with the same wounds. She needed someone who could hold space for hers without making them about their own. She realized now that compatibility isn't about mirroring. It's about complementing. It's about the balance between emotional expression and emotional containment, between speaking and truly hearing. And that leads to the second lesson: media doesn't tell the full story. She had consumed so much content, advice columns, relationship podcasts, feminist essays, all trying to map out what men lack, what women need, what healthy looks like. But none of them told her how complicated it would feel when she saw her own behavior reflected back at her in someone else. None of them prepared her for the ways both men and women can be emotionally unfair, or manipulative, or distant. None of them told her that gender doesn't shield you from being the problem. She remembered scrolling through posts about green flags and red flags like she was preparing for a test. As if the goal of dating was to avoid being hurt rather than learning how to grow. But love isn't safe. Love isn't predictable. Love is a mirror, and sometimes what it shows us hurts. And that brings her to the final truth, the one that changed everything. Mature people don't play the blame game. Emotional maturity isn't about having perfect communication skills. It's about ownership, about being able to say, "That was on me," without crumbling. It's about managing your reactions, taking responsibility for your triggers, being able to pause, breathe, and choose clarity over chaos. She once thought maturity came from inside. Now she saw it came from discipline. Emotional discipline, the ability to love without controlling, to ask without demanding, to feel deeply without expecting others to fix it for you. And none of that has anything to do with gender. She had been so focused on whether men could meet her needs globalement, or whether women were better at it, that she missed the bigger truth. It's not about men. It's not about women. It's about adults. "I don't date men or women anymore," she said to a friend over coffee. "I date emotionally mature people. That's it." Her friend laughed, thinking it was a joke, but she meant it. She no longer cared what gender someone was. She cared whether they could sit in discomfort without running, whether they could handle honest conversations without defensiveness, whether they knew how to listen without waiting to speak. That was the new filter. That was the new standard. And it wasn't cynical. It wasn't closed off. It was honest. It was the kind of love she'd always wanted to give and now finally wanted to receive. Not love that required perfection, love that required growth. And for the first time, she wasn't scared of asking for it. So who was right? She doesn't think men were right about everything, not even close. Some of the criticism was fair, some of it wasn't. There were times when she felt truly unheard by men, and those moments were real, valid. But now, with all the distance and reflection behind her, there was one thing she could say with absolute certainty. Men were right about this. Love is not a battle. It's not a power struggle. It's not about winning or being right or proving who's more emotionally evolved. It's not about reading minds or setting traps or testing people to see if they care. It's about showing up raw, messy, honest, and hoping someone else is willing to do the same. When love becomes a war zone, Everyone loses. Because the moment you start keeping score, you stop being present. The moment you fight to control the dynamic, you forget why you're there in the first place. Love should feel safe, not strategic. Supportive, not suspicious. Challenging, but never competitive. She looked back at all her past relationships with men, with women, and saw one shared thread: people trying to protect themselves instead of understanding each other. People too afraid to be honest, too quick to blame, too slow to listen. It wasn't about gender, it was about fear. And when fear drives love, love breaks. So maybe no one was entirely right. But maybe the question was never about sides. Maybe the real question is this: have you ever misunderstood the opposite gender? Have you ever assumed they were cold, when really they were scared? Have you ever judged them for not getting it, before asking if they'd ever been taught how? And if you have, would you be willing to stand in their shoes just once, not to excuse, but to understand? Not to agree, but to empathize, because maybe that's where everything starts to change. Not in being right, but in being willing.